data. I work statewide with Minnesota communities, really helping them understand what's happening with their economy and then thinking about how economic change might affect them. So I'm going to share a couple insights as Eric mentioned related to the CEDS priorities that we're going to discuss today. It is a lot of data. I get very excited about data. But in case you can't write fast enough or you saw something and you want to go back to it, when you go into the breakout sessions, each of your moderators and note takers will also have copies of this so you can ask to see some more data if you'd like to at that point. I'm excited to be part of this. I feel like I've gone full circle with the CEDS process. Back in my first professional job when I moved back to Minnesota was helping to get together a database for communities that were putting together a CEDS. Since then, I've participated in a number of these, including as being a committee member like you are today. So we really appreciate your time and your being here with us. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about a few things related to data. I do want to be fair and say out front that these are my views. Again, I work across the state of Minnesota, so I look at a lot of data. I consulted with the Metropolitan Council when I put together this presentation, but these really represent my views and not necessarily the official position of the Metropolitan Council on any of these ideas. So with that, the first CEDS priority that I'm going to talk a little bit about is related to job growth. So when we look at job growth in the Twin Cities metro area, one thing that you might see that pops out at you right here, if you look at this chart, is from 2010, so coming out of the Great Recession to 2019, we saw nice, steady job growth in the Twin Cities region. We hit COVID, as many other regions of Minnesota, as well as the United States. You see a drop off in the number of jobs. And then by 2024, we're kind of back at about where we were pre-COVID. So there's kind of two stories that you can tell from this. The first is, hey, we're back at sort of, we've quote unquote recovered from COVID. We're back at the number of jobs we had or close to that prior to COVID. But the other thing is, if you think about, we were sort of on this trajectory in 2019, we were sort of growing at this particular rate, and COVID really knocked us off that growth rate. And if we'd have been able to stay on that growth rate, we might have had higher job growth. Eric, I saw a chat. Is that directed at me or should I keep going? Guillermo says keep going. All right, perfect. And so one of the questions you might ask yourself is, well, how does that compare to other regions? Are we kind of on the same pace? Are we not keeping pace with our peers? And so this shows the change in jobs, in the number of jobs by different regions across the United States. You can see some of the communities that we're comparing ourselves to. This is basically indexed to 100 or to 2019. So that 100%, if you're below the 100%, that means you've lost jobs compared to 2019. If you're above that 100%, that means you've added jobs since 2019. And for reference, here's a line that kind of shows where that is. If you remember, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities region was a little bit below. So if we look here at March of 2025, there are only about 3 regions that have not really seen job growth post-COVID. So the majority of our peer regions have added jobs, maybe not at huge rates, but we are one of 3 that really have not. So our job growth has not kept pace as much with our peer regions. So you might be asking yourself, okay, so what are some of those kind of underlying conditions that are helping to drive this? One way we can look at this is, where are our job recovery? What industries have we gained jobs in? So if you look across from 2019 to 2024, sectors that have added or industries that have added jobs in the Twin Cities include healthcare and social assistance, transportation and warehousing, and construction. So those were places where we saw job growth. But there were a significant number of industries where we continued to lose jobs post-COVID. So you can see kind of the long line here. If you look below really that real estate and rental and leasing industry, you can see most of these are service related. So we've really struggled in the Twin Cities area to continue to, have job growth, and we've even continued to see job loss across a lot of our service sectors, and that's maybe where we're seeing some struggles. It's important to note that we can have one large business that might have some sort of change, whether they decrease their labor force or they move out of the region, and that can affect this. But these are ones that we might want to be asking ourselves some additional questions about why we're losing jobs there. Moving on to our second CEDS priority around workforce and skills. I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone in this room, but there are more job openings than people looking for work in the Twin Cities. As of 2024, we have 75 people who are unemployed and seeking work for every 100 job positions that are open. So we definitely are, kind of have more ability to work if we have more people in the labor force. And this isn't something that's new to us or new to our region in particular. Here, the maroon are the job vacancies. Bold are the number of people unemployed in the Twin Cities region. So you can see during the Great Recession, we definitely had more people looking for work than we had people, jobs available for them. But even by 2017, we're in this kind of tight labor market where we have more job vacancies than we do people seeking work. So this is a structural thing for our region. It is not new, and it probably isn't coming with any quick or easy solutions. The shortages are easing as we see more people coming back into the labor force. Hiring is maybe slowing a little bit, but we're still in this position, and we probably will be. So you might be asking yourself, kind of, what are some of the drivers of that? Well, it isn't really necessarily that we don't have people in the labor force. So this is a number of people in the labor force in the Twin Cities region. It's people who are either employed or actively seeking work. In a lot of greater Minnesota communities, we see a much larger drop in 2020, 2021. The Twin Cities saw some people go out of the labor force in that time period, but by and large, they've come back in. So our labor force, in terms of the people who are in it and really looking for work, or working, is been pretty stable in the Twin Cities. Where we do see some disparity is when we start to look at labor force participation rates. And those do tend to be different by racial and ethnic backgrounds. So if we look at just kind of labor force participation rate in Minnesota has historically been strong. Here, the top line, that kind of blue colored line is the white workers, and they are participating in the labor force at about 84%. But you can definitely see some of the other populations, particularly our Black and multi-race groups, not participating as high in the labor force. Still, we must note, over 75%, just not as high as the white population. One of the reasons that people may not be choosing to participate in the labor force is because our jobs just aren't paying enough to support a family. So we've made progress on this. In 2023, about 70% of jobs paid enough to support a family, but we're still at the point where about 1 in every 4 jobs doesn't pay enough. So that might be a reason that people would opt to not be in the labor force. As we look at kind of how are we going to address some of these issues, it may become to the point when our foreign-born workers and our unemployed workers have a key role to play in workforce growth. So if we look at this chart, sort of that brick color and that blue color toward the bottom, that's our domestic labor force, our U.S.-born population that's in the labor force. And so, that number is been fairly steady and is projected to stay fairly steady. It's kind of a outcome of our demographics. But where we see potential growth in the labor force is if you kind of look at this kind of tan greenish color, that's the number of foreign-born workers that are in our region and in our economy. And so they are coming in and we are seeing growth in that region. Another potential market here, if you look down at the bottom, is our unemployed. So we have people who are actively seeking work for whatever reason. It could be structural reasons they are not employed, but those are potential opportunities to bring into the workforce as well. And part of that is due to perhaps racial and ethnic barriers. So if we look at the unemployment rates by those different categories, we can see the unemployment rate for Black and African American workers continues to be higher than many others. Whites have the lowest unemployment rates of all of the different groups. Estimates by the Met Council show that if we could eliminate some of those disparities, we could add, 41,000 workers to the economy, which would fill a significant portion of those open jobs in the Twin Cities area. When we look at kind of what's holding back, one of the things we economists like to talk about is structural unemployment. Maybe we just don't have the right people for the right jobs. Part of that comes down to education and training. So if we look at high school graduation rates, this is the 4-year high school graduation rate for the Twin Cities as of 2024. You can see white students and Asian students had the highest graduation rates, but we have some significant disparities when it comes to our American Indian, other indigenous folks in the community, having those lower graduation rates. This also exists into the post-secondary credentials. So if you look at the percent of Minnesotans who have a certificate or higher credential, the gold is 2015, the kind of reddish color is 2024. So we've seen improvements, right? We are making progress here, but we still continue to see that workers who are white, who are Asian, of Asian descent have higher credential rates than, say, our American Indian or Hispanic Latino populations in Minnesota. And part of that may just be driven by barriers to be able to persist in post-secondary environments. So if we look at graduates from the Twin Cities area in 2018 and whether they're continuing to be enrolled and engaged in post-secondary opportunities year after year after year, you can see there are decreases in the number of students that continue to be engaged. But unfortunately, people of color tend to have lower persistence rates than white students. And then finally, when we look at our last CEDS priority that we're going to be discussing today, we have racial inclusion. So just a couple of things related to that. As I mentioned, educational attainment does vary by race and ethnicity. We looked at it from the perspective of high school graduation rates, but if you kind of flip that on its head and look at a bachelor's degree or higher, the white alone population and the Asian alone population has about a 50% have a bachelor's degree or higher, where it's about 20% for American Indian or about 25% for Black and African Americans living in the Twin Cities region. When we add on that some college or associate's degree, you can really see some of the impacts here. The white alone population, about 80% have some sort of post-secondary achievement, where it is lower for other groups. And then we can layer on, we talked about that already. And that's driving some disparities, likely driving some of the disparities in earnings. So if we look here at real earnings for workers in the Twin Cities metro area, you can see the white population, white workers have significantly higher earnings than, say, even Asian workers do. And then if you look at Black, African American, and American Indian, Alaska Natives also having those lower earnings as workers. And if the Met Council research shows that if we can eliminate some of those racial gaps, we could see up to $11 billion in additional economic activity in the region as those workers are able to fill open positions and earn money for their families. And speaking of families, that lower earnings is translating into household income variations. So for households with Asian or white led households, you can see the average or the median household income is over 100,000. It is close to half of that for households of American Indian or Black or African American heritage. And this is translating into sometimes wages just not matching the cost of living to sustain a family. So I think this chart shows us two things. One is, that this does really add up for families, right? So if you're a white or Asian family, you're at about half of the workers earn enough to sustain their families, whereas it's much lower for some of our other groups in the state of Minnesota. But it also shows out that we tend to talk about groups as a whole. So we talk about Asian descent or Asian populations, but you can see the experience might be much different if you come from an Indian family versus if you have a history or connection with Hmong culture. So there are definitely some differences. Somali populations, for example, only at about 20%. So there are some disparities within our different cultures as well. And finally, if we look at business ownership, we talk about work is great, but business ownership is also a way to create wealth. Entrepreneurship is a path forward as well, but we see disparities there as well. So if we look at the dark maroon here is the percent of businesses. White-owned businesses are the most common type in the state of Minnesota. And then the light pink there is the percent of population. And you can see that there is some significant changes there. So for a Black or African American owned businesses account for about 5% of the businesses, even though people of Black or African American heritage account for about 10% of the population. So there are definitely some differences in business ownership rates as well. So with that, that's what I've got for some data. I'll hand it back over to Eric. Again, these slides will be available to you in your breakout rooms if you have questions.